Before we dive into today's unbelievable story of HOA corruption, betrayal, and ultimate revenge, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. We post true HOA nightmares and Karen chaos every week, and you don't want to miss the next shocking episode. Now, let's begin. Marcus Hale never imagined that a stretch of forgotten farmland would change his life, or nearly ruin it. He was 47, tired from years of back-breaking construction work, and newly single after a messy divorce that left him with little more than his truck, his tools, and a stubborn streak of determination. When his late grandfather's lawyer called with news of an inheritance, Marcus thought it was a fresh start, a second chance to rebuild. The land wasn't much to outsiders, 20 acres on the edge of a once quiet valley, bordered by pine forests and winding gravel roads. To Marcus, though, it was salvation. His grandfather had worked this land decades earlier, raising cattle and planting apple trees that still clung stubbornly to life. Now, with most of the buildings collapsed into weathered skeletons, the place begged for renewal. Marcus sold what little he had left in the city and packed his life into a trailer. His plan was simple: clear the old foundation, build a modest log cabin, and create a place where his teenage son, Daniel, could escape the concrete jungle on weekends. The first weeks were peaceful, filled with the rhythm of hammer and saw, the crisp scent of pine sap, and the cry of hawks overhead. For the first time in years, Marcus felt the heavy ache of failure lift from his shoulders. But the valley was not empty. On the ridge above his land stood a cluster of gleaming new houses, built less than 5 years earlier. Wide porches, manicured lawns, and pristine driveways lined with expensive SUVs gave the impression of wealth carefully maintained. These homes were governed by the Stonebrook Homeowners Association, a small but powerful group that had begun extending its influence like ivy, reaching beyond its original boundaries. At first, Marcus noticed the SUVs more often, their tires crunching along the gravel road as drivers slowed to peer at his cabin site. Then came the pamphlets, tucked under his windshield wiper, glossy sheets describing community standards, architectural harmony, and mandatory dues. He dismissed them as a mistake. After all, his land wasn't part of any subdivision. His grandfather had purchased it long before Stonebrook was even dreamed up. The mistake became confrontation on a bright Monday morning. 3 black SUVs arrived in a line, pulling into the dirt access road with military precision. Out stepped a tall woman with sharp features and an air of absolute authority. Her name was Eleanor Price, president of the Stonebrook HOA, a figure both feared and obeyed by those who lived under her rules. She did not waste time. Within hours, Marcus found a notice nailed to the remains of his grandfather's barn. It declared his construction unauthorized, his trailer unsightly, and his activity a threat to property values. A demand followed: immediate cessation of all building, removal of materials, and compliance with Stonebrook covenants. The notice cited fines that doubled weekly, escalating into the thousands. Marcus laughed at first. How could rules written for a gated community apply to land that had existed independently for generations? But laughter faded as the harassment intensified. Anonymous complaints flooded the county office. Inspectors appeared on his property, scribbling violations that made no sense: alleged environmental damage, unpermitted excavation, fire hazards that didn't exist. He began to realize the HOA wasn't making idle threats. What Marcus didn't know yet was that Eleanor Price had ambitions far beyond enforcing lawn care. 6 months earlier, she had been approached by developers with deep pockets. They wanted his land, the last untouched parcel in the valley, to complete a luxury resort project. Without it, their planned golf course, spa retreat, and private airstrip would fall apart. In exchange for delivering Marcus's property, Eleanor had been promised not only a generous commission but also a lifetime membership in the exclusive resort community that would replace his grandfather's farm. To Eleanor, Marcus wasn't a neighbor. He was an obstacle standing between her and fortune. The harassment escalated. One morning, Marcus found roofing nails scattered across his driveway, shredding his truck's tires. Another day, his half-finished lumber pile was drenched in diesel, the stench of sabotage heavy in the air. Anonymous flyers appeared on telephone poles, warning that a dangerous drifter had moved into the valley. Parents were cautioned to keep their children away. Marcus began to feel the weight of isolation. His nearest ally was an older farmer named George living 5 miles down the road, a man who'd seen the HOA's tactics before. Over coffee one evening, George explained how the association had bullied 3 other families out of their homes in the past year. They called it community improvement. In reality, it was quiet land theft, disguised behind paperwork and intimidation. Marcus understood then that he wasn't just fighting for a cabin. He was fighting a machine built to crush anyone who stood in its way. But Eleanor had underestimated one thing: Marcus's stubbornness. Years of construction work had taught him to solve problems others considered impossible. Divorce had hardened him to humiliation, and his grandfather's final words, remembered faintly through childhood, echoed in his mind: "This land carries more truth than men can bury." Determined, Marcus began documenting everything. He photographed notices, recorded inspectors, and saved every false citation. At night, he sat in his trailer, studying county records by lantern light. He discovered curious timing. The Stonebrook HOA had redrawn its boundaries just months after his grandfather's death, stretching its reach to encircle his land like a noose. Worse, every board member was either related to Eleanor or employed by her husband's construction company. The truth became clear. This wasn't community governance. It was organized greed. Marcus's resolve hardened, but so did Eleanor's determination to crush him. What began as paperwork soon spiraled into something darker: sabotage, smear campaigns, and threats that reached into his family life. His son Daniel, once eager to visit, now called nervously after classmates spread rumors online that Marcus was a criminal. The valley that had once promised peace now carried the heavy scent of war. Marcus stood at the edge of his half-built foundation one cold evening, the mountains glowing red in the setting sun, and knew he had a choice. He could walk away, as others had done, or he could fight. He chose to fight. And with that decision, the battle lines were drawn. Marcus's decision to fight back hardened like the curing concrete of his half-built foundation. What Eleanor Price and her board didn't understand was that intimidation only fueled his resolve. Every cease-and-desist notice nailed to his barn wall became another piece of evidence. Every fabricated fine or fraudulent inspection report was copied, dated, and filed neatly into a binder that grew thicker by the week. The first weapon Eleanor wielded was paperwork. She believed the sheer weight of legal threats and bureaucratic red tape would break him. But Marcus had learned long ago that paper walls collapse when pressed hard enough. Instead of folding, he visited the county courthouse. The musty smell of old records mixed with the hum of fluorescent lights as he combed through property deeds. He discovered a glaring truth. His grandfather had never signed the Stonebrook covenants. The association had extended its jurisdiction after his death, attempting to bind land already owned outright. Dead men cannot sign contracts, Marcus realized. The HOA's claim was a house built on sand. But truth alone wasn't enough. Eleanor controlled perception. She painted Marcus as a rogue builder and a threat to property values. Her influence reached county officials, inspectors, and even local businesses that suddenly turned him away. At the grocery store, neighbors whispered behind his back. Contractors who once promised to help refused to return calls, afraid of losing jobs within the Stonebrook community. The harassment grew physical. One evening, Marcus returned from the courthouse to find his lumber pile splintered as though a sledgehammer had struck each board. His generator lay overturned, fuel spilled into the soil, the chemical stench heavy in the air. Roofing nails glittered across his driveway like deadly confetti. It was no longer a war of paper. It was sabotage. Marcus installed cameras, motion sensors, and floodlights, using every ounce of his electrician's skill. Nights became silent vigils in the cabin frame, watching screens for shadows that crept across his property. More than once, headlights appeared at the edge of his access road, only to vanish when the floodlights snapped on. Eleanor, however, escalated her campaign through fear. A Facebook group emerged under the guise of community safety. His photo, pulled from a union newsletter years ago, was plastered beside warnings about dangerous transients. Parents were urged to keep children inside. The lies metastasized, poisoning the valley with suspicion. Marcus's son Daniel, once eager to visit, called less often. At school, classmates whispered that his father was a criminal. Daniel's voice, once bright with hope, carried hesitation. The battle was no longer about a cabin. It was about reputation, family, and survival. Despite the smear, Marcus kept digging. At the courthouse, a sympathetic clerk hinted at suspicious finances. The Stonebrook HOA had collected nearly $1 million in special assessments within 6 months, yet there were no records of improvements. No new facilities, no shared amenities, nothing but pristine lawns and Eleanor's gleaming SUV. Where had the money gone? Marcus traced paper trails late into the night. Consulting fees to companies that didn't exist. Landscaping contracts paid to Eleanor's brother-in-law in another state. Security services billed at rates that could fund a private army. It was theft hidden in plain sight. But fraud was only part of Eleanor's ambition. Digging deeper, Marcus uncovered the resort project. A $50 million development plan had been submitted to the county. His 20 acres lay at its heart, the scenic centerpiece, the Golden Key. Without it, the deal collapsed. Every day he held out cost Eleanor and her partners thousands. Suddenly, her obsession with removing him made perfect sense. She wasn't protecting community values. She was chasing fortune. Knowing the truth strengthened Marcus, but Eleanor wasn't finished. When paperwork and sabotage failed, she turned to county power. Inspectors arrived in force one morning, citing violations that didn't exist. Electrical work perfectly up to code was labeled hazardous. Septic evaluations were marked as failures without tests. The inspector, eyes downcast, muttered apologies Marcus barely heard. Orders had come from way above. The message was clear. Someone had serious pull at the county office. Marcus realized he couldn't fight this alone. He needed expertise, someone who could wield the law as effectively as Eleanor twisted it. Through a friend of a friend, he found a real estate attorney named Laura Chen. In her office, surrounded by fresh coffee and files stacked like fortresses, Marcus laid out his evidence. Laura flipped through each document with practiced precision. "This isn't just harassment," she said. "This is fraud, boundary manipulation, and possibly racketeering. If we build this case, we can turn their power against them." The word sparked hope. For weeks, Marcus had been on the defensive, weathering blows from every side. Now, with Laura's help, he could strike back. Together, they mapped a strategy. Lawsuits for harassment, counterclaims for fraud, federal complaints regarding falsified documents. Each piece of evidence Marcus had collected became ammunition. Every photo, every recorded inspector's visit, every flyer was sharpened into a weapon of truth. But Eleanor wasn't blind to his resistance. She sensed her grip slipping and unleashed her cruelest tactic yet. Marcus's ex-wife, Julia, called one evening, her voice trembling with fury. Their son Daniel had been shown posts claiming Marcus was a predator, unfit to be around children. Daniel had locked himself in his room, crying, asking if the rumors were true. Marcus felt a cold rage like nothing before. Eleanor had crossed a sacred line, dragging his child into her war. The cabin he had dreamed of building as a refuge for Daniel now stood as a battlefield scarred by lies. Yet even in despair, Marcus recognized the desperation in Eleanor's attack. Only someone cornered would stoop so low. And desperate people make mistakes. The battle was no longer just for land. It was for his name, his family, and his future. And as he stood on the porch that night, the valley shrouded in silence but for the sound of distant owls, Marcus swore he would not only survive, he would win. Because Eleanor Price believed she was playing chess, moving pieces across a board she controlled. But Marcus had found something stronger than pieces. He had discovered the board itself was his to flip. The war for the valley had only begun. The valley seemed quieter in the days that followed, but Marcus knew the silence was not peace. It was the calm before another storm, the kind of heavy stillness that pressed on the lungs and made the pine forests feel watchful. Eleanor Price had not surrendered. She was regrouping. Marcus, meanwhile, buried himself in records. The courthouse clerk, a woman who had grown tired of Stonebrook's constant bullying, slid him old boxes of documents with a look that said more than words ever could. Inside those boxes were decades of deeds, maps, and covenants. Dust clung to his clothes as he spent hours flipping through faded pages, hunting for any shred of leverage. What he found shifted the ground beneath him. 6 months after his grandfather's death, the Stonebrook HOA had redrawn its boundaries. The map was almost surgical, extending just far enough to encircle his 20 acres while excluding surrounding farmland. It was not coincidence. It was a trap laid specifically for his inheritance. The ink was barely dry on the new boundaries when special assessments began appearing in the HOA's records, money pouring into accounts controlled solely by Eleanor and her inner circle. The numbers were staggering. In less than a year, the 12 families of Stonebrook had paid over $800,000 in assessments. That was more than $60,000 per household. Yet no clubhouse stood on the hill, no swimming pool gleamed in the sun, no playground echoed with children's laughter. The money had simply vanished. Marcus thought back to his ruined lumber pile, his slashed tires, his vandalized generator. Those acts of sabotage were desperate, reckless, and sloppy. But this was calculated theft on a scale large enough to ruin lives. With Laura Chen's help, The evidence grew into a case file that read like the script of a crime drama. Fake landscaping companies receiving five-figure payments despite existing only on paper. Consulting fees routed to addresses tied to Eleanor's relatives. Legal research expenses billed at rates higher than those charged by Supreme Court attorneys. Laura's conclusion was clear: this isn't mismanagement. It's embezzlement. Still, Marcus understood something even more dangerous. Eleanor wasn't stealing just for greed. She was on a deadline. The resort project he discovered wasn't a vague proposal. It was real, funded, and scheduled. Developers had poured money into plans that required his land as the crown jewel. Every day Marcus held out, Eleanor's carefully built tower leaned closer to collapse. That desperation explained everything: the smear campaigns, the sabotage, the false inspections. Eleanor was not merely protecting her kingdom, she was gambling everything on delivering his land. If she failed, she didn't just lose money. She lost her reputation, her influence, and likely her freedom. The thought filled Marcus with grim satisfaction, but also caution. Cornered animals were most dangerous when the walls closed in. While he built his case, Eleanor escalated her theater of control. More fake safety signs appeared along the gravel road, warning of hazardous construction zones. Local contractors received anonymous complaints that Marcus was running an illegal waste site. Some neighbors began blocking his access road, parking their vehicles just close enough to force him into impossible maneuvers. Each tactic was small, almost laughable, but together they formed a suffocating net. Marcus refused to bend. He reinforced his security, upgraded cameras, and wired floodlights that turned night into noon at the first hint of movement. His construction slowed, but he continued laying beams, hammering nails, and driving screws with the steady rhythm of defiance. Each strike of the hammer was a declaration: "I'm not leaving." Then came the night of proof. Near midnight, motion sensors triggered. A pickup truck crept down the access road, headlights off. The cameras captured every detail: the slouch of the driver's shoulders, the tilt of his head, the gas can glinting under the floodlights. The man poured accelerant across Marcus's lumber pile before freezing, eyes wide, staring directly into the camera lens. It was no stranger. It was Thomas Price, Eleanor's son. The evidence was undeniable. Marcus delivered the footage to the sheriff's office the next morning, USB drive in hand. Deputies paled as they watched the video. The act wasn't vandalism, it was attempted arson. For the first time, Eleanor's fortress cracked. Her family was exposed. News spread quickly. Though Eleanor tried to frame the incident as misunderstood youthful recklessness, the story didn't hold. Neighbors began to whisper not about Marcus, but about her. If her own son was sneaking around at night with gas cans, what else had been hidden? And if the HOA truly had nothing to fear, why was Eleanor so desperate to destroy one man's cabin? Still, Eleanor did not retreat. Instead, she doubled down. The very next week, Marcus received an injunction claiming his cabin was an illegal commercial facility. According to the paperwork, he was allegedly planning to operate transient housing for undesirable elements, a phrase so carefully venomous it made his stomach turn. Alongside the injunction was a demand for $100,000 in damages, plus immediate demolition of all construction. Marcus sat at his unfinished kitchen table, papers spread before him, the smell of pine sawdust lingering in the air. For a moment, exhaustion threatened to crush him. Every victory seemed to spark 3 new battles. Every piece of truth uncovered was met with another layer of lies. But then he remembered Daniel's trembling voice on the phone, asking if his father was really the monster painted online. He remembered his grandfather's weathered hands pressing a deed into the family Bible, muttering that land was more than soil, it was legacy. He wasn't just building a cabin anymore. He was defending his name, his bloodline, and the promise of freedom his grandfather had left behind. Laura studied the injunction with a sharp eye. "This is theater," she said. "It's not about winning in court. It's about wearing you down until you surrender. But Marcus, we're past defense now. With what we've gathered, we can go on the offensive." Marcus nodded. For weeks, he had endured the HOA strikes. Now he finally had weapons of his own. Proof of fraud. Evidence of arson. Records of falsified boundaries. And behind it all, the looming specter of a resort deal built on corruption. The tide was shifting, and Eleanor Price, blinded by ambition, was too deep in her own lies to see the trap closing around her. The valley was no longer just a battlefield. It was a stage, and Eleanor was about to provide her own downfall in front of the entire community. The first autumn storm rolled across the valley as if summoned by the tension between Marcus Hale and Eleanor Price. Rain lashed the unfinished cabin, drumming against plywood walls while thunder rattled the mountains. Marcus sat inside with files spread across a folding table, light from a single lantern reflecting off the glossy photographs and stamped documents that proved Eleanor's empire was built on lies. For weeks, she had controlled the narrative, painting him as an outsider, a drifter, a danger. But the attempted arson changed everything. The sheriff could downplay it, and Eleanor could spin her son's actions as a mistake, but the video told its own story. And in small communities, whispers grow louder than speeches. Neighbors who once avoided Marcus now slowed when passing his property, curiosity replacing hostility. A few even rolled down windows to offer a nod or a muttered word of encouragement. The tide was shifting, not quickly, but steadily, like the slow turning of the season. Laura Chen pushed the momentum further. She filed harassment claims, demanded a forensic audit of the HOA, and alerted federal investigators about possible fraud. Eleanor's once unshakable confidence began to falter. Where she had once dictated the terms of war, she now scrambled to defend against attacks on multiple fronts. But Eleanor did not surrender. Instead, she deployed her most dangerous weapon, fear. Late one night, Marcus discovered a new barrage of online posts. Screenshots circulated across community groups, portraying him as unstable, violent, even predatory. Blurred photos of him working with a circular saw were framed to look like weapons. False accusations of criminal behavior spread with viral speed. The lies reached Daniel's school, where his son was forced to answer whispered questions about whether his father was safe. Marcus felt a hollow ache deeper than any sabotage could cut. Eleanor had invaded the sanctuary of his family, poisoning the fragile bond between father and son. But even as despair threatened to smother him, a sharper realization cut through. Eleanor was overreaching. Lies that grotesque, rarely survived the light of scrutiny. The light arrived from an unexpected source. Bethany Morrison, the HOA's treasurer, had long been uneasy with Eleanor's unchecked power. When Marcus's evidence of financial fraud reached her hands, fake invoices, phantom companies, impossible expenses, her discomfort turned to fury. She had watched neighbors drained of savings under the weight of special assessments, only to see no return for their sacrifice. Eleanor had mocked her requests for an audit, dismissing her concerns as paranoia. But now, with proof in hand, Bethany realized the association was nothing more than a personal cash register for Eleanor's ambitions. She arranged a private meeting with Marcus at a local diner, far from Stonebrook's polished facades. Over weak coffee and the smell of fried bacon, she confirmed what he suspected: the HOA accounts were a black hole. Money went in, and nothing came out but Eleanor's luxury. The resort deal explained everything. Eleanor had bled her own neighbors dry to position herself for the developer's payout. Bethany agreed to help. She leaked internal memos, bank statements, and draft contracts that tied Eleanor directly to the resort. With each document, the foundation of Eleanor's power crumbled further. But Marcus and Laura needed more than proof. They needed exposure. Fraud hidden in files could be ignored. Fraud aired in public became impossible to deny. The opportunity came when Eleanor, desperate to reclaim control, called for an emergency HOA meeting at the Stonebrook Community Center. Her goal was to rally frightened neighbors against the dangerous outsider. She expected an audience primed to cheer her theatrics. Instead, she stepped onto a stage already seeded with truth. The meeting was packed. Nearly every Stonebrook family attended, along with county officials and, most importantly, reporters from a Denver news station tipped off by Laura. Cameras lined the walls, red lights blinking like unblinking eyes. The smell of nervous sweat and damp autumn coats filled the air. Eleanor opened with fire. She projected slides of Marcus's cabin, calling it an eyesore, a hazard, a threat to property values. She cited fake fines, claimed he owed nearly $100,000 in violations, and painted a picture of a rogue builder intent on destroying their community. Her voice carried righteous indignation, her gestures sharp, her smile confident. But confidence cracked when questions began. A reporter asked about the HOA's financial records, noting the discrepancy between assessments collected and expenses reported. Eleanor stumbled, claiming confidentiality. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Neighbors shifted uneasily in their chairs. Then Marcus rose. He walked calmly to the front, binder in hand. The cameras followed his every step. He did not need theatrics. He laid out documents with quiet precision, bank records showing phantom companies, invoices for non-existent services, payments routed to Eleanor's relatives. And finally, the crown jewel, the resort proposal highlighting his 20 acres as the essential centerpiece. The room exploded. Gasps, shouts, and questions drowned out Eleanor's sputtering denials. Neighbors who had once feared Marcus now turned on her, demanding answers. County officials scribbled notes, their expressions grim. The reporters captured every word, every expression, broadcasting the unraveling of Eleanor Price live to thousands of viewers across the state. Marcus felt no triumph, only weary resolve. This was not victory yet. Eleanor still held influence, and desperate people did desperate things. But the tide had turned irrevocably. The narrative no longer belonged to her. It belonged to the truth. That night, Eleanor retreated to her fortress on the ridge. The HOA board fractured, whispers of rebellion spreading among members who had once been loyal. Some spoke of resignations, others of legal action. Bethany Morrison quietly resigned as treasurer, choosing instead to cooperate fully with investigators. Yet Eleanor was not finished. Her desperation only deepened, her rage boiling. And when rage ruled her choices, chaos followed. Marcus slept lightly that night, the storm outside echoing the one building inside Stonebrook. He had won the crowd, exposed the fraud, and shifted the community's allegiance. But victory was not secure. He knew Eleanor well enough to understand she would not go quietly. Somewhere in the valley darkness, a fuse had been lit. The Stonebrook Valley woke unsettled after the explosive community meeting. For the first time in years, Eleanor Price was on the defensive. Her polished mask had cracked under the glare of cameras, and the whispers of fraud refused to fade. But Eleanor was not the type to surrender quietly. She believed power belonged to those willing to seize it, no matter the cost. Within days, new attacks began. The first arrived in the form of legal papers delivered to Marcus's cabin at dawn. The documents accused him of operating a commercial facility without permits, claiming his unfinished cabin was intended as transient housing for criminals and addicts. The injunction demanded immediate demolition, $100,000 in damages, and a restraining order preventing him from stepping foot on his own property. Marcus read the pages slowly, the smell of damp pinewood thick in the air. The accusations were absurd, but their intent was clear: paint him as a menace beyond repair. Laura Chen shook her head in disbelief when she reviewed the paperwork. "This isn't a lawsuit," she said. "It's a scare tactic. And it's reckless. Eleanor's leaving a trail of lies we can use against her." But Eleanor wasn't finished with paper warfare. The next volley came wrapped in flashing lights. 3 county inspectors arrived unannounced, clipboards in hand, combing his property for violations that didn't exist. They photographed walls, measured beams, and scribbled notes as if cataloging a crime scene. The lead inspector, eyes weary, muttered under his breath, "Orders from the top." Marcus didn't need to ask whose orders those were. By evening, the harassment escalated online. Eleanor's allies in the HOA plastered Facebook with fabricated warnings. Marcus was branded unstable, violent, even predatory. A grainy photo of him carrying a circular saw was framed to look like a weapon. Posts claimed he had threatened to burn down the neighborhood. Parents panicked, children whispered, and Daniel, his son, once again bore the weight of cruel rumors at school. The cruelty struck deeper than any lawsuit or citation. Eleanor had weaponized fear itself, poisoning Marcus's reputation with venomous lies. For Daniel, the cabin that had once symbolized hope now felt tainted with shame. His voice cracked when he called his father, torn between belief and doubt. The distance between them widened, and Marcus's heart ached with helpless rage. But desperation makes mistakes. And Eleanor, driven to preserve her crumbling throne, began reaching too far. Laura's investigator uncovered financial withdrawals from HOA accounts, over $120,000 in cash pulled within 2 weeks. The supposed purpose: emergency security consulting. In reality, the money vanished into Eleanor's personal accounts, a desperate siphoning to cover debts and buy loyalty. Worse still, she had pressured HOA families to sign loyalty pledges, promising not to cooperate with investigators. Fear kept them silent, but cracks spread quickly. Neighbors whispered about missing money, unpaid invoices, and Eleanor's tightening grip. Then came her boldest, and most foolish, gambit. One morning, Marcus received notice of an emergency petition filed in county court. Eleanor claimed he was unstable, paranoid, and dangerous. Attached was a psychological evaluation from a Dr. Richard Payton, diagnosing him with violent tendencies and antisocial behavior. The petition sought to have Marcus committed for psychiatric evaluation, an involuntary hold that could strip him of his rights and force him off the land. The accusation might have succeeded, if not for one damning detail. Dr. Payton had been dead for 6 months. Laura's paralegal uncovered the death certificate in a matter of hours. Eleanor had forged the evaluation using stolen letterhead and an outdated signature stamp. What she intended as her most devastating strike instead exposed her to felony charges for document forgery. It was the moment Marcus realized Eleanor's empire was collapsing under the weight of her own lies. She had grown reckless, no longer the calculating queen of Stonebrook but a cornered predator lashing out blindly. The sheriff, once hesitant, grew visibly uneasy with the evidence piling against her. Deputies quietly shared concerns, whispering that Eleanor's influence could not shield her forever. And when Marcus delivered the forged psychological report alongside financial records and arson footage, even county officials who had once bowed to her began to retreat. Still, Eleanor did not stop. One night, just past midnight, Marcus's cameras captured a figure creeping across his driveway. Motion-activated floodlights flared, illuminating Eleanor herself, gas can in one hand, road flares in the other. For weeks she had accused Marcus of plotting arson, but here she stood, caught in 3 separate angles, attempting to frame him by starting a fire of her own. Her scream of frustration as the floodlights exposed her echoed across the valley like the cry of a cornered animal. She fled into the night, but the damage was irreversible. Marcus now possessed undeniable proof of her criminal intent. The next morning brought chaos. Emergency vehicles swarmed the access road, news vans trailed closely behind, and neighbors gathered in clusters whispering about what they had seen online. Eleanor, desperate to control the narrative, spun a new lie. Marcus was armed, dangerous, and threatening to blow up the community center. She had filed false police reports, backed by fabricated witnesses and staged photos of his concrete supplies labeled as explosives. Sheriff's deputies surrounded the cabin, rifles trained on Marcus as helicopters hovered overhead. Through it all, Marcus stood calmly on his porch, coffee cup in hand, waiting for the moment to end the charade. When the sheriff approached, Marcus handed him a USB drive. On it was the footage of Eleanor's midnight arson attempt, her face illuminated in high definition, her guilt undeniable. The sheriff's face hardened as he watched. Within hours, Eleanor's lies unraveled live on television. Reporters who had once parroted her accusations now aired footage of her holding accelerants on Marcus's property. Her claims of terrorism dissolved under scrutiny, replaced by headlines of fraud, forgery, and attempted arson. By evening, the once untouchable president of the Stonebrook HOA stood surrounded not by loyal neighbors but by federal investigators. Her influence, her reputation, and her freedom crumbled in a single day. Marcus, weary but unbroken, watched from his porch as news vans rolled down the mountain road. He knew the battle was not yet finished, lawsuits and investigations would stretch for months, but Eleanor's reign was over. The community had seen the truth with their own eyes. And truth, once revealed, could not be buried again. The morning after the standoff, the valley carried a strange silence. Not the oppressive kind Marcus had felt before Eleanor's attacks, but a lighter quiet, as if the air itself was relieved. News vans rolled away, leaving only muddy tire tracks and the faint smell of diesel. The sheriff's deputies no longer lingered at the edge of his property. For the first time in months, Marcus stood on his porch without the weight of fear pressing on his chest. But battles do not end in a single night. They unravel slowly, through hearings, filings, and courtrooms that reek of stale coffee and paper. Eleanor Price, once untouchable, now found herself shackled by her own lies. Charges piled like stones: wire fraud, document forgery, false police reports, attempted arson. Federal investigators seized her accounts, uncovering the full extent of her embezzlement, nearly $1 million siphoned from her neighbors under the guise of special assessments. The HOA board fractured completely. Those who had once bowed to her commands now distanced themselves, claiming ignorance or coercion. Some resigned quietly, others cooperated in exchange for leniency. But no one could deny the truth. Eleanor had run the Stonebrook HOA like a personal kingdom, draining its coffers while terrorizing anyone who stood in her way. Courtrooms became stages where her empire crumbled in full view. Reporters packed the benches, scribbling notes as prosecutors laid out spreadsheets of fraud, video evidence of arson attempts, and sworn testimonies from neighbors who had finally broken free of her intimidation. Eleanor tried to hold onto her practiced poise, but each revelation stripped it further. By the time sentencing arrived, She was no longer the regal president of Stonebrook but a hollow figure staring at years of prison walls. The verdict landed like a hammer: 18 months in federal prison, restitution of $150,000, and permanent removal from any Homeowners Association leadership. The Queen of Stonebrook had fallen. For Marcus, the aftermath was not simple victory. He carried scars invisible to cameras: the sleepless nights, the lies that had reached his son, the constant gnaw of fear that one wrong move would destroy everything. But slowly, those wounds began to heal. The first sign came from Daniel. After weeks of silence, his son arrived one Saturday with a hesitant smile and a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. The valley air, sharp with pine and fresh rain, seemed to wash away months of doubt as Daniel walked up the gravel drive. He had seen the news, read the truth, and realized his father was not the monster Eleanor painted. That night, as they sat by a crackling fire in the half-finished cabin, Daniel spoke of college plans, dreams of studying engineering, and the relief of finally knowing his father's fight was for both of them. The cabin became more than a project. It became a symbol. With help from neighbors who once avoided him, Marcus raised beams, laid shingles, and poured sweat into every board. The very people who had once whispered about him now brought casseroles, lent tools, and asked for advice. The valley that had nearly destroyed him was slowly rebuilding itself, one act of trust at a time. The Stonebrook community, freed from Eleanor's chokehold, voted to dissolve the HOA entirely. In its place rose something different: a cooperative fund that pooled resources not for fines and surveillance, but for improvements that mattered: road maintenance, a community garden, scholarships for local kids. Marcus, once the outcast, was asked to help guide it, his resilience seen as proof of leadership forged under fire. But his greatest act was one of restraint. With the leverage of property deeds and evidence of fraud, Marcus could have evicted families who had sided with Eleanor, reclaiming his grandfather's land in full. Instead, he chose compassion. Through the help of Laura Chen and the newly formed cooperative, he created a path for families to purchase their land at cost, free of inflated mortgages and false fees. It was a chance at true ownership, something Eleanor had stolen from them for years. Word spread beyond the valley. The case became a symbol of resistance against corrupt HOAs, inspiring families across the state to question, to fight, and to demand transparency. Laura helped Marcus establish the Hale Justice Fund, a non-profit dedicated to supporting victims of HOA abuse. Donations poured in, stories surfaced, and soon, the valley that had nearly broken him became a beacon of hope for others. On a warm spring evening, months after Eleanor's downfall, Marcus sat on his finished porch with Daniel beside him. The cabin stood proud, its log walls glowing golden in the sunset. Laughter drifted from a nearby potluck where neighbors gathered, children playing in what had once been Eleanor's restricted common area. The smell of barbecue smoke mixed with wildflowers, carrying the promise of renewal. Daniel unfolded a letter in his hands, eyes shining. "Full scholarship," he said, voice steady with pride. He had written about his father in his application essay, about resilience, truth, and the courage to stand against corruption. The admissions committee had been moved, awarding him a future brighter than Marcus had ever dared hope. As twilight deepened, Marcus thought of his grandfather. He imagined the old man's weathered hands guiding him still, whispering that land was more than soil, it was legacy. A legacy not of greed or fear, but of strength, integrity, and community. Eleanor Price's reign had ended in shame, but from its ashes rose something greater. Families once divided now shared meals. Neighbors once silent now stood tall. And Marcus, once branded an outsider, had become the foundation upon which a stronger community was built. The valley had kept its promise after all.